Education through the Orthodox Christian Network. This is also a ministry of the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm Michael Howdis, your facilitator, and we're going to begin our discussion. So today's topic is called the unlimited and limited nature of free will and freedom. And there's a relation between the two, obviously, but they're obviously not the same thing. And John, you were kind of the inspiration for this a little bit after last week when you said, I'm thankful I just exist, in last week's list. And I started thinking about it. That stayed in my head because I'm like, I think we're all thankful we exist. Sometimes we have hardships, but we certainly have the joys of life, right? Even the joys amidst the hardship. And I think we're all glad we exist, right? I don't think there's anybody in here who wants to cease to exist. And I thought, what a wonderful thing about the beauty of existence where we have freedom. Right? So much of us, even in the constraints of life, we have a lot of freedom to choose. Right? Everybody on the planet, even though some have more hardship than others, and some, but especially in this area where we live, we're very gifted with a lot of ability to exercise our freedom with our free will. And I thought about just the joys of that. We heard it in the sermon today in the prodigal son, right? The joy of the return of the young man. I was thinking, we get these glimpses of joy, kind of like the Transfiguration, where you get a glimpse of something larger, bigger, better, more beautiful, just enough to keep us going in whatever we're doing. And then I started pondering that how we have this gift of free will, but sometimes we use it to willingly submit to conditions of slavery. Okay, and I came across a quote from Dr. Timothy Petitsis, who I've quoted quite a bit this year. His book Ethics of Beauty, a wonderful book. But he said God's freedom is the total activation of His inner truth and goodness, of His divinity, beauty, and His love for the world. And I thought, when we have this activation of the goodness that He's bestowed upon us, how wonderfully liberating, free it feels, no matter what your circumstances, right? We've talked about some hardships, and you've all been gracious to me, knowing some things that my family's going through, but I don't think they're any different or more challenging than a lot of you or what you're going through, particularly in your life. But even in the challenges, you see the beauty. You see the beauty of care for others. You see the choice to bear one another's burden, bear somebody else's burden, even if they brought that burden on themselves. There's beauty and freedom in that. So really, the more we become like God, the more we become Christ-like through participation in Him. This activates our own goodness that He's given us. So really, what I wanted to explore today in just a free-form discussion, I have some prompts to get us going, but I want to explore this whole notion of the relationship between free will and freedom, and why or why not it's so easy for us to choose conditions that we think are gaining us freedom, but like Father Stephanos said in his beautiful sermon, are actually creating for us conditions of bondage. Before we get into discussion, I've brought this up many times over the years, but remember how Christ announced His ministry according to the Gospel of Luke? He quoted Isaiah 61:1. One of the things He said, I've come to bring liberty to the captives. And of course, everybody's like, well, they didn't like it that day because He was accusing them. But in general, they're like, great, you're going to bring liberty to the captives. We're the Jews, they're the Romans, start liberating us, right? Wait a minute. You're not doing what we wanted, get out, right? So they actually gave up their freedom by their choices. And I think, that's our condition today. He still wants to liberate us from whatever captivity, but it's not usually what we think. So I guess my first question is, and this is kind of open-ended, do you agree with the supposition or what I'm saying, that we often trade in our freedom for things that we think gain us freedom? And if so, what are some of the primary ways we do that? What are the things we do? What are the things we think? How do we go about doing that? If you agree with me, and if you disagree with me, let's have a good dialogue.
I think one of the ways to perhaps consider this is what's the motivation when a person gives up a beheld freedom, an understood freedom, for something else? What's the motivation for that? I think of in my son's life. He works on Wall Street, seeking the freedom of unlimited, enormous funds. He will be paid. But the burden of this has given him a kind of slavery. He's asleep with his phone under his pillow. Hong Kong calls in the middle of the night.
That's why I don't work at a law firm anymore.
Yeah.
So law, money.
But it certainly is, it's just astonishing to me how those connect. What is the motivation? I think that's.
Well, I think certainly hit on one. I mean, we all, and there's a reality to it to some extent because of the conditions we created ourselves. But financial freedom is something many of us want because we don't want to be slaves in some other sense. But I think,
It is so complicated.
yeah, but at the same time, you can take something to an extent where you're actually perhaps
Worshiping mammon.
worshiping mammon or falling into other behaviors that drive that are enslaving as well, while at the same time maybe buying worldly freedom for a time, but not freedom within. I thought I saw your hand. Go ahead,
Can
John.
I ask you to distinguish in your question what you mean by freedom and free will?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, essentially, without giving this too much thought,
Yeah.
free will is based on my freedom to act or think or carry out in certain ways. So am I confusing the two terms, or do you mean specific, distinct definitions by freedom?
Say that again. Make sure.
Freedom and free will.
Yeah.
Both of these concepts are in your question.
Right.
But I'm not sure if you are saying they're essentially the same thing, like one or the other, or are they two different things in your question? Because offhand, it seems to me like it's kind of the same thing, right? Free will is based on the freedom that I have to take actions, to think a certain way, to live my life a certain way. Right? So I have the freedom to carry out my free will, or am I just getting too?
No, I don't think I'm thinking getting
Help me
convoluted.
understand.
I don't think you're getting convoluted. I think there's a couple different ways to look at it. I can tell you what was in my mind when I was putting it together was I saw them as different, where free will is unbounded, right? There's nothing to bind our exercise of free will. But then within the choice, we're given, we have a choice then how we exercise our freedom. I guess is what I'm trying to illustrate. In that what we perceive to be freedom isn't really freedom. So therefore we exercise our free will wrongly or not healthy for us. That's ultimately where I'm going. I don't know if I'm really answering your question about how I define them, but I'm really talking more the relationship than more the definition.
So without getting ahead of the conversation.
No, there's no getting ahead today.
Right, and based on some of the classes that you've taught in the past, freedom, as we understand it in a Christian sense, is the wise way is to submit to the will of God. So it's not freedom in the human sense, it's freedom in the Christian sense. That we are free to choose the right way, but that right way is not necessarily what we discern, it's what's been granted to us by God.
Yes. And
we don't think of obedience or submission to God as freedom. As
no, it's oppression.
That's oppression.
Right.
Whereas that's actual genuine freedom, like you said at the beginning of this class, sort of that release, that entrusting of oneself or one's life to God is freeing, is liberating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Christ often said at the end of one of his teaching, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And if you look at the Hebrew word that's translated obey in the Old Testament, it means to hear. And so not everybody, like Christ said, many are called, few are chosen. Wide is the gate that leads to destruction. So not many hear the way they should to then submit themselves to Christ to gain the freedom he wants to give us. Like Father Stavros, who's an OCN contributor, he said it like this. That's why I was looking at my papers. I knew I wrote something down here. He says God gave man free will. There is no question. He also set a parameter on our freedom, but not our free will. And I think that's the distinction. That's what struck me, is that we have unbounded free will, but there's parameters set on us for our freedom. But even before sin, look at how Adam and Eve perceived it. Well, they probably, I mean, they were convinced, they had a little help prodding to convince them, right? But they had freedom, but he set a parameter on them: don't eat of this tree. And St. Gregor the theologian reminds us that the intent was don't eat of it yet. You're not ready, right? It wasn't that never to eat of it, but you don't eat of it yet. But what did they do? They exercised their freedom to seek life apart from God, as Father Alexander Schmemann teaches. And in doing so, in seeking life apart from God, they brought on conditions of slavery. They abdicated authority, right? They remember that in the temptation in the wilderness, the devil says, all authority has been given to me. That points back to the garden where they abdicated authority to the devil. That's how he gained the authority. So, so basically, whether we look at those things literally, metaphorically, doesn't matter. What the teaching of the church is that what we see is how easy is it for us to make choices that actually take away our freedom, all the while we think we're actually exercising and gaining freedom.
No, it's incredibly easy because it's human nature. We just tend to compartmentalize everything, and that in and of itself, we're acting on free will, but it's not necessarily making us free and giving us the freedom to be subservient or to be obedient, if you will. Because we go, okay, this is church, this is work, this is family, this is extracurricular. And so by not melding everything together and submitting, we become slaves to our own thinking and own compartmentalization and activities that way. And I won't speak for anyone else, and I'll say I then, thinking about this, then become a slave to that compartmentalization, and thus, sometimes compartmentalization, and thus, while I think I have freedom and free will, do you really? In that situation, I would submit no.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the point about the compartmentalization is important because obviously there's a healthy aspect of compartmentalizing things, but I think when we speak about it spiritually, the growth in Christ is all about integration, right? The body, and sometimes if we compartmentalize things where we think, okay, this is sacred over here, but this is secular here, this is spiritual, but this is material, and we start losing that, it can, even if we don't have ill intent, the result can be
Right.
we're falling into a pattern in the context of freedom where we're robbing ourselves of our freedom. The other thing that struck me too, especially today's talk about spiritual compartmentalization, what about being freedom to our own righteousness, or a slave to our own righteousness? Isn't that what the last 2 Sundays have mainly been about, or 2 of the last 3?
You expound upon that a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. So we look at the publican and the Pharisee, right? The publican, the tax collector, lowest form of life, right? According to that culture back then, but yet that was the person who was justified in his humility before God. Whereas the publican, I fast, I do this, I do that.
He's a slave to the list.
But he did everything right. Even the parable of the rich young, according to the law, he was doing everything. The parable of the rich young ruler. This rich young ruler was doing all the right things.
That's like the
Prodigal son stayed with his father, the brother, did all the right things, but he was a slave to his own righteousness. That's what I mean by that.
But that's why, without getting into too much into politics, as we don't do that in here. But in terms of defining society or defining anything really, be careful to dehumanize or attack, lest you become what you're attacking, or become like that. In your when you said self-righteousness, what kind of sparked that in me, because, you know, sometimes we can go, oh, you know, I'm not like that,
Right.
you know, but by judging, as it says in Matthew, you know, judge ye not that ye be judged, in your self-righteousness, you're losing, you think you have your free will and freedom, but you're actually losing it.
I was like that in my mind. Whenever I fall into that pattern, I'm glad I'm not like that. I was like that at the end. Yet, just to remind myself. Yet, you never know the possibility. But I think that in the in the religious life, in the sacramental life, especially in the Orthodox the Orthodox Christian way, it's easy for us to fall into a pattern of a spirituality, potentially easily, that is not as that we can actually become slaves to that, where we can be a little bit like the older brother, a little bit like the publican, right? Because and maybe I'll throw this out. Have you ever been in situations where there's a demand upon you and you just don't want to do it, right? Have you ever been in a situation where there's a demand made upon you, right? And you just don't want to do it?
Today?
Every day. Like, you know, I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I've shared with you know some of the health stuff going on in my life. I'm like, there's some stuff I just emotionally, mentally, I just don't want to do, right? I'd much rather be teaching a class today or going into liturgy or all those things that just feel good. But what do? If you're Christian, you do them anyway, because Christian love isn't about how you feel; it's about what you do, right?
You just deal with it.
Yeah. But what I think, and maybe you'll share your experience. I think what we all found, at least what I find, I mean, I'd like my internal dialogue to be better, to feel better about myself. But it's much more important that I do what I'm supposed to do, right? And then what I found and made me think about this is a reminder: there is freedom in doing what Christ wants you to do, right? We look at it maybe as bondage at first, but there's freedom within it. There's
freedom for others, but it all depends on the choices. Every time you come to freedom, you have a choice. You come up with you can either do this or you can do that, but you have the freedom to do that. You know, but you have to deal with the consequences of what you're doing when you make that decision.
yes, and I think the consequences are, you know, you look around. Sometimes you've seen people make choices, and you've seen the consequences of their choices, and you think to yourself, "Oh, glad I didn't make that choice." But then for me at least, then the sobering thought is, who knows what choice am I making now that I have no idea there are going to be consequences in my future that aren't good? And then will somebody be there to make the choice then to help me when I need it, even though I don't say deserve it, but you know, there's nothing. I brought this on myself, and it's things like that. And that's like, you know, Paul said in Galatians 6:1-2, he says two things. He says, bear one another's burdens, but don't be a burden. Hey, Paul, pick one, right? You know, stop confusing us because you're so much smarter than the rest of us. But there's truth to that too. It's how we use our freedom. But
Didn't Father speak to this in the sermon today when he referred to the older brother?
Yeah.
Who did what was expected of him, but it sounds to me, I've always thought he was calculating older brother. I'm doing this, that means I have to do this, and that means I'm going to do this. And when his younger brother, the prodigal son, returned, and the father, their mutual father, responded to him, the brother, wait a second, I've done everything right, and you've never done this for me. So it seems to me the component that is essential here is the joy of doing. So do what's expected of you, but
Yes,
be joyful about it.
but it's also,
But then what?
but you know, but
And the then what is the great question.
yeah, but then what to me is the submit is what we talk about in here, which is much easier said and discussed than actual doing, is the submitting.
discussion is always easier than doing.
But I mean, because in the older son's doing, that part was partially submitting, but then in the obviously the jealousy or the I can't think of a better word than jealousy, resentment. That's not submitting. That's not being obedient to God or the situation, and that's we have to kind of take.
I think the oldest son didn't think it was fair. That's in his thinking.
No,
He thought that this was not fair. Okay, and that's why he said what he said. And then why did he feel that way? You know, that's the question. Why did he feel that it wasn't fair to share with his younger brother?
Because his heart wasn't oriented rightly. Instead of being joyful in the conditions he were in, which were far superior to what his brother did, he brought the wrong heart to it. Andrea, you've been patiently.
I'm taking this into just a situation that I deal with because we do have freedom. We have freedom in this country, but with societal and however you want to say political norms, societal pressures, there are choices. And I've had to make hard choices as a parent when things come home and you could take your orthodoxy viewpoint, the way you want your kids to live, but know that if you voice that viewpoint, there are going to be negative consequences coming towards your children in school systems and things like that. Yes, we have freedoms, but if you actually voice some of those out loud, it's not exactly acceptable with the societal norms that are going on today. So it's the choices, but the consequences of the choices, even if you believe that those choices are the morally right choices. So have I done always the right thing? I've stayed quiet sometimes, wishing I could say something, but the reaction may be more harsh for my children if I were to say something and fight for that freedom and what is right than just stay quiet. So that is a constant struggle that I have, whether it be with what doctors say to my children, what the educational system says to my children, the societal norms, things on TV. And that's a day-to-day struggle in my house.
Yeah, I think we all go to some extent, especially depending on what life stage we're at with our children. I think one thing, there's many things we could react to, but I think one thing is it's good to not to be too self-involved about it, but it's good for our own self-assessment of where we really are, right? For humility, because I think we'd all like to think to some extent we'd be as brave as martyrs or whatever, but most of us, and it's okay. Meaning that it's a good thing to look at where we are in a humble way, and then how we move forward with the choices. And I don't know what the right answers are. I've been faced with some of the same things, and I've even been sensitive sometimes if I teach or say, because I don't want ramifications to other family members as well, because we live in this society where it feels like you're on the edge of potentially being persecuted for your faith, right? And I don't know what the reality is in the bell curve of people, where people really are versus where the people who control the dialogue really are. I suspect it's not as bad as it's being made to think in terms of, but maybe I'm wrong,
Can you give me a tangible example? Because we're just talking, like Andrew, you mentioned.
Well, let's talk about gender confusion, right? Let's just give an example.
Something.
Yeah, there's a far cry for always being kind and compassionate, because there's all kinds of real problems out there. But when activist segments of populations take any issue and try to make it something, then how do you react to that, right?
Or like transing like teenagers.
I'm just saying there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff being told to young people that we have to be aware of, and then what's the line between, like, I remember my daughter came home and said, this is years ago before this all became stuff, and she's like, well, so and so is becoming, the girl is becoming a boy. What do I do? Just be kind. Just be kind. I said, you don't know what she's going through. I'm not trying to be coy. I don't know the right way to refer when these things happen. But I'm like, just be kind. People have all kinds of struggles, right? And that's not, That's your job as an individual person to be kind and compassionate. And to them, what I noticed was to a lot of the groups, the youth groups, a lot of things aren't big deals. They get upset when the adults are making them big deals. They're like, now it's going to make people hate us more, right? And so that's
So for instance, I got an email from my children's school. Here are resources for white parents to raise non-racist children.
Oh, shoot.
Wow, stated like that.
Stated, like, here are resources for white parents to raise non-racist children. Not here are resources for all parents to raise children who accept all cultures. White parents.
I think go ahead. Sorry.
You know, so those
How do you
types of,
respond to that?
how do you respond to that and not, you know, those types of things when my children don't even see race.
Yes, what do you do about it?
Yes.
What do you do?
Do you let it go and allow that to go on and have that reflected in your children told something in school? Or do you know, where do you go with that?
Here, I see a timidly raised hand. Let it go.
I need his permission.
Permission. I am not your keeper, sir. Go ahead.
The difficulty in all of these conversations, I think, comes down to what we talk about over and over again in this class, and what I heard Father Stephanos tell us again based on the prodigal son passage. And that's how difficult it is, genuine Christian.
Yes.
So difficult, right? And we never perfect it. We're always striving
Right.
toward perfection. But if I
A
heard
good
Father
example,
Stephanos,
that's a good example for children, for all of us, that we're all striving.
but if I heard Father Stephanos correctly, the main lesson from the older brother is that if you just go through the motions of, kind of like the publican, of doing all the things you're supposed to do, but your heart isn't opened up to Christ, then it's all for naught. Like we're just going through a lot of piety and whatnot.
Well, that's
So the hard part is taking all of this, repenting, transforming ourselves, and trying to be genuinely Christ-like, even when other people do really stupid things that deservedly irritate us and infuriate us. But somehow the issue is, but that's,
It's true.
but our response has to be with a Christian heart, one way or the other. And even to your point, where you hear about people who are doing terrible things to themselves or to their children, and the first thing you do is you pray for them. What I tell my sons.
Yeah.
These people if they have problems, pray for them. We don't know what the answer is, but it starts with pray for them, and then somehow we'll figure it out. But it was interesting because in many ways, you can't fault the older brother, right? The younger brother squandered everything and went and did the worst things and comes back and everyone celebrates. And the first thing is, it's not fair.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what we humans consider to be fair may have nothing to do with the mind of God. Right? So we sit here quibbling about what's fair and what's not, and how we people think about these things, as opposed to the freedom to understand what God expects of us.
Well, Christ addressed that at the end of, he addressed it many places. What comes to mind, the end of the Gospel of John. Peter got him over there about John, remember? And Christ said, what if I say he remains until I come again? You for me. In other words, you follow. My story is for you. You don't need to worry. So, yeah, there's inherently, actually, God is fair. But on this side of the grave, in the sinful world, we're going to experience things in a way that are temporarily unfair. But in God's grand plan, justice is putting everything back in order, putting everything back fairly. That's what justice is. Justice isn't retribution. Justice is putting things back in order. God, beginning of Genesis, God's got everything in order. Sin is disorder. Whenever he puts something back in order, the people that are sitting on top of the disorder reaping from it, they see it as punishment. No, just things are getting back in order, right? You've exercised your freedom wrongly, and now I'm intervening and setting things straight. That's what you made me think too about fair. Especially if you're an older sibling, you ever get, at least in the Greek culture, you ever get a good whacking for things you did wrong, but then by the time the third one comes along, they change their view how they parent. They're like, wait a minute, he's not getting beaten for what I got beaten for. He's getting off the beat him,
Or you get beaten for what the younger ones did because you didn't
Yeah, you get
oversee.
it's all kinds of unfair beatings that happen. But remember what I said in the beginning. I tried to emphasize it, but maybe I didn't come across better half is calling. So we become more Christ through participation in Him, right? So remember what He says. A couple of places He says, "Away from me or depart from me, I never knew you." Remember what Christ said that? We talked about. I don't know if it's the sheep and the goats, but what He's saying there is to the prodigal, to the older brother, or to the Pharisee, I don't know you because you're not participating in me. You're choosing your freedom to participate with yourself, right? You're not choosing me. You're not being a sheep. You're not loving others. You're not, taking care of the sick or whatever, visiting the sick, taking care of the poor, right? And we have all this crazy emphasis today on many different things, but freedom breeds true diversity, because in freedom, when we use our free will for freedom, we develop our personhood the way God wants us to be, and other people do too, and we experience a true diversity of persons. And I think another thing we have to be careful of is, with all the tribal stuff today, it's easy for us to look at another group and think that group's sinful and we're not, and that's got to go out the window, right? I mean, we heard Paul talk about sexual morality and all this stuff. That happens at all levels, in all kinds of ways. So one group's not necessarily worse than the other. So it is, we gotta, as Christians, our job is to love first, and love isn't always an emotional thing. Like I said, it's the action we take. So loving action, we come to church. It's through participation in Christ, because we want to be Christ-like. We want to have the right heart. In humility, we see ourselves for what we are, and we see where our hearts are wrong, but we don't go into self-execution mode, self-flagellation, right? We use that to seek Christ more, like the brother did, right? He didn't sit there and beat himself up for his terrible choices. He's like, I'm an idiot. When he came to himself, what am I doing? He said, I'd rather go get the crumbs of my father's table than this. I'm stupid. And he was humble. So I don't know. There's a lot that goes on here. And I think we have to be careful in today's climate that we don't fall prey to a lot of the tribal dialoguing and stuff. And just remember that really our job first and foremost is to always be kind, compassionate, loving. That takes various forms. And that's really, that's a tremendous exercising of our freedom by our free will. So sorry, I got on kind of a roll there. John.
Still trying to make sense out of the
Please.
concepts here. Listening to you several times now, it seems to me that what you're saying, whether you intend this or not, is that free will is the gift from God, not freedom. It's free will.
Yes.
That's the greater concept. And then we exercise that free will, hopefully properly, to attain freedom. Not the same.
They're not.
Free will is the grace from God, not freedom.
Yes.
Freedom is the outcome of our decisions using free will, ideally, properly.
Because He didn't create us as robots. So and we don't know the mind of God, obviously. We know through Christ and how the Holy Spirit reveals Him to us. But He created us with a choice, to be free, to make choices. And of course, I'm agreeing with you to say that right up front, but that we should use our free will, this tremendous gift, to do to
choose
freedom
over enslavement.
Yes.
Enslavement to our passions, to disorder, to chaos, to all of these things that are against Christ.
And to be very aware of how subtle the devil can be to make us think that we're free until we wake up, wait a minute, right? I mean, I was arguing, they brought up politics. I hate to do that because politics get so crazy, but it's a couple of people in my life, that's all they ever want to talk about. And they think I'm just some sort of, some ideal Christian guy, what do you know? And I'm like, you're not hearing me. So I tell the person, I'm like, I am not saying that these things aren't important that you're talking about. Everything's important. Everything in life is over here. I said, but it's about getting things in the right order. I said, your messianic obsession with political leaders they're not gonna solve the problems that you're talking about. Of course, it's important to have good leadership. It's important to have good politics. All that's incredibly important. I'm not saying don't discuss it, abdicate all responsibility. I'm just saying, let's start at the top, what's most important. And that is how our relationship with God so we can become Christ-like as possible. That's all good. That's church stuff. That's I get a lot. But
I think,
yeah, it gets back to what you said, the
yeah,
compartment.
but I think you also have to discern something that you've said several times, and others have said, and you mentioned the word hearing,
Hmm.
but to me, and others may come full of it for this, but to me, there's a difference between hearing and listening. 'Cause hearing just means you've heard, to me, whereas listening means
Comprehension. Comprehension.
correct or trying to comprehend.
And it's an active thing.
Well,
Right.
listening also
Yes.
means it
Right.
also has another connotation of listen to me, like obey me. And in fact, in Greek, the word I think for obey is like agu, which has the word agu, like I'm listening.
Yeah, hearing. Probably derivative of like the
Yeah,
Hebrew, the
so-
hearing. Yeah,
so
listening.
there's so many similarities between the two.
Yeah.
And then I've said this before, and this is to me such a key concept because I fall into this all the time where I'm listening when I'm talking to someone. Often I'm hearing to respond and not listening.
That's right.
And
You're not alone, don't worry.
yeah,
Why do you think I make notes as we talk? Because I'm doing my best not to be what I want to say. I listen to you. That's why.
but something else I've said in here, and the point of this is, and I find great irony in this. Great irony is listen and silent are spelled with the same letters.
Never thought of that. That's pretty good.
Pretty good.
I know. I'm writing it down. So and
Because also
my friend
actively-
said my next podcast listening.
If you're actively listening, you're listening also not just to the words, but you're trying to understand
Yes,
the
yes.
perspective of the speaker,
Yes.
not how you want to interpret it, but how they mean it. So active listening and just hearing are way two different things.
The cold, Elizabeth.
Now, excuse me. So, free will. I always think of free will as free will to either love God or reject God.
True.
I mean,
Yeah.
But I almost look at it solely in that sense, like whether not more expansively. And this goes back to are we robots or not? God wants us to truly love Him, but how can you tell if you truly love somebody if you don't give Him the freedom to do that with her?
Well, yeah.
And then it goes back to the Holy Trinity too. I mean, one way I've heard the Holy Trinity, maybe allegorized or considered is how can you really have a loving God that's just one person?
Right.
The Trinity is three people or three persons that love each other, but it's one entity.
Yeah. It hurt your
One
head.
concept.
It hurt your head after a while. But to your point, it's important that we understand that's the God we worship. That's the God we believe in, the Trinitarian God, the communal God. And I think as Metropolitan Callistos, where I don't know if he said this quote or was quoting a Holy Father, but dwelling together in a perpetual movement of love with each other. So, right. And we've talked about it, just the concept of God, just alone in himself, then he creates to have subjects, not to share love, right?
That's halacha and-
Yeah, so it's a different-
Halacha.
it's a different,
That's a Greek way.
Yeah. Well, Christ said, you brought up a couple of things. I've said this before, I got to be careful. So in many ways, our faith is tremendously easily binary, right? Either love God or reject God, right? And Christ said, if you love me, you keep my commandments. So our love for Christ is what we do. It's so easy today, I think. Maybe you don't think, maybe I'm just not involved, but I think it's so easy to be so caught up in these nonsensical notions of love being all your emotion, how you feel. Not that, again, not to denigrate that, because feelings and emotions are what enrich life, right? They're important things. But if we fall slave to this lesser understanding of love as that, then our relationship with Christ will be very much dependent upon how we feel. And then as opposed to what we do. And he made it clear, do what I tell you. Not in that kind of way. This is how you show you love me.
On a more superficial basis initially is what you're talking about, as opposed to having it kind of more deep rooted.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem a lot with the way we teach Christianity in the West I'm not distinguishing like we're Eastern and they're Western. I'm saying all of us because we all live in the West. Doesn't matter if we're Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. It's very pedagogical. It's very Western influence where we miss such depth, and really to gain that depth is through actually doing the things of Christianity, right? Going to church, praying, serving the poor, serving whoever is right around you. It's doing all the things, and those things over time, we become more and more Christ-like through the doing. And a lot of times it starts, and that's what's really important today. It starts in ways that initially feel to us like we're giving up freedom, and that maybe not in all cases, but a lot of times that may be our first clue to really take a pause and think it through before we don't do something, right? Because
Mike, I think there's a great illusion about freedom, right? Freedom. To be quite honest with you, who's totally free to do whatever they want to do? Maybe a hermit out in the desert in a cave. Yeah, they could do a dance or yell or whatever. I'm sure they could do whatever they want because nobody's around. But and I was thinking, Andrew, about the thing with the school system. Well, there's freedom here in America, but if I go through the traffic light, I could get in an accident. The police officer could pull me over. I have a school system that maybe has a good intention, but they do it in a numbskull kind of a way. So you say, oh, I'm here, I'm free. I'm not in North Korea. Well, yeah, but even here, the land of the free, there's a lot of constraint on you. So really, when we talk about, freedom, and some people look into Christianity like, oh, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. Well, if you have a substance abuse problem, say, you're a slave. Yeah, right. In a different fashion. So the concept that you're free and you just do whatever you want anywhere is that's not really reality.
But that's a lot of what's being perpetuated today. This type of notion of freedom, which just leads to shame and slavery.
Yeah.
And then it gets perpetuated because we've talked about things about shame. That's a whole different subject. But you really think about it too. Most of us aren't going to leave here. Well, maybe some of us will, and run a traffic light, or at least consistently, right? Run a red light. We submit to order on purpose because we understand there's freedom within that order, right? And where does as institutions are being questioned, instead of being reformed, being sought to be torn down or whatever, we're playing a perilous game as we create more disorder. But we all willingly submit to a level of order without thinking about it. We talked, was it last week, the week before? We talked about the athletic example of how the athlete, maybe it was a podcast, I don't know, will do so many things. He or she will do so many things willingly and sacrificially to attain something. We don't necessarily bring that same ethos to our faith life, or that you notice what gets attacked more and more. Christianity gets attacked a lot with a lot of superficial arguments that they wouldn't make to some of these other things I'm talking about. They'll talk about, the hierarchical church and church, oppression, and it makes you want to follow rules. And like, all the rules you willingly follow without questioning because you know that they're better for you. And so we just have to be on guard against those things. But I think ultimately, again, really the point of today more than anything else was just a discussion to remind us that with free will, we need to but prayerfully always look to how we're exercising it with our notions of freedom, and make sure that we're doing it as best we can in a Christ-like way, because it's better for us, it's better for everybody around us, it's better for everybody. And a lot of that is counterintuitive to what we initially think.
I know our time is short. I just want to bring in one
Sure.
pop culture reference here, kind of tying into what you were just saying, Michael, about how we exercise our free will and avoid enslavement and pursue and hopefully attain freedom as God wills it for us. And that's the movie The Usual Suspects.
Oh, yeah.
That famous line.
Kaiser Soze, is that the one?
Kaiser
Yeah.
Soze,
Yeah.
who says that the greatest trick that Satan has ever foisted on humanity is convincing us he doesn't exist. And once you don't consider the evil one and the spiritual warfare that we're all immersed in, then it's easy to choose the path of enslavement without even realizing it.
Yeah, which is
Good point.
fantastic point.
Well, it's not mine, it's Kaiser Soze. The writers of The Usual Suspects.
You're bringing it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a fascinating concept. But we we don't believe in spiritual warfare. Not we, but I'm just saying, as a society, we've all of these notions aside, and we've become enslaved to our own logic and our own reason and our own understanding of who we are, without the considerations of, say, Christian wisdom. That
Lord, I believe,
hopefully can
oh,
listen.
my unbelief.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a relatively recent development in societies. I mean, what, since the Enlightenment period or right around then, and most of known culture, whether it was always, there wasn't such a thing as a secular reality, right? It wasn't necessarily everybody believed a certain one thing, but there was always a belief in God and the gods and different and that. So we're still in a very macro picture. We're still figuring this out, and I don't think we've come to the rock bottom of where it leads us, right? As we move forward. But yeah, and the devil operates that way by convincing us he doesn't exist, or through half truths. That's how I get.
Corruption of the truth, right?
Yeah, that's how Eden started. The corruption of the truth. It was kind of a half truth, right? How he deceived, because he wasn't entirely wrong on what would happen if they ate of the tree, but the motivation was, So yeah, so we have to be aware, and that just how do we stay aware? Well, we stay aware through the life of the church, but mostly in that life, it's the community. It's things like this, right? Where we interact among each other, we fill in blanks that someone didn't think about before. We enrich each other through our own gifting. Another lie, I guess we can end on this, is he doesn't exist, but also the lie of individuality, divorce from personhood. This digital divide, all this stuff you think about. We're almost C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, drifting further and further from each other as all these geniuses tell us how they're building communications and bringing us together. The exact opposite's
It
happening.
only costs you this much.
But the opposite's happening, right?
Exactly.
So I'm convinced now more than ever that we have to always do our best to cultivate face-to-face situations when we can. Not that these devices don't help certain things. I mean, there's some popping, but man, we start losing that, we're going to start losing our humanity, because it's so easy to hate or so easy to think negative thoughts when you don't have that person in front of you, and that's
Actually, that the renunciation of freedom, it appears that it's comfortable. I'm looking at organizations, we do this, we do this, we do this. My husband is a Roman Catholic. Follows all the rules, reads them, it all work. I choke and leave the house.
I've had many fun ecumenical, good-hearted debates with my friends of other faith traditions, and it's always enriching and always fun.
There seems to be, and much has been written about the sense of security that people have that belong to organizations that make decisions for you, and it's like on your Osterizer, you follow the rules, don't put ice in here, and it's going to work forever.
No, there needs to be that synergy between, just like there's clergy, laity.
Yes, that's the free will.
There's a synergy between hierarchical leadership. It doesn't mean it's flawless. It doesn't mean that we don't have to reform or fight for reform and stuff. But tearing down is throwing the only cliche, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So anyway, I think we'll close here. So I hope this was edifying. I hope this was a good discussion, and somebody took something from it that is going to help them today, the week. So we will. What's the date next Sunday? The 19th. I'm back at time and all this excitement. Okay, we'll be back for the next few weeks, and then we'll take a break for the Sunday Orthodoxy, and then we'll be moving into Lent very soon. So God bless everyone. Have a blessed day. Have a blessed week, and we will see you next Sunday.